Before we begin, if you're fascinated by real criminal investigations, hidden evidence, and the psychology behind true crime, subscribe now. We uncover a new real case every week. October 2022. In a quiet residential area of East Leonards, Dorset, England, investigators gathered around the backyard of a house once owned by Andrew Griggs. They weren't looking for a missing person. They were searching for a truth that had been buried for over 23 years. After hours of digging, officers discovered a container buried deep underground, beneath a structure in the garden. When the container was opened, what was inside closed one of Britain's most famous no-body cases. It was the remains of a woman. Shortly after, forensic examination confirmed her identity. It was Debbie Griggs. The pregnant mother had disappeared from Kent in 1999. What made this discovery even more remarkable was how the police found the burial site. Not thanks to a neighbor, not from a gardener, but from one of Debbie's own children. After being sentenced to life imprisonment in 2019, Andrew Griggs tried to involve his son in a scheme to create false evidence to prove that Debbie was still alive. In the process, he revealed the exact location where the body was buried. It's a paradox that's hard to explain. For years, Andrew maintained that his wife had voluntarily left home. But if that were true, why was he the only one who knew exactly where Debbie lay for over 2 decades? The bin under the garden wasn't where the story began. It was just where a lie that lasted over 20 years was finally buried. But that's only the first part. To understand why Debbie Griggs' disappearance has captivated investigators for over 2 decades, we need to go back to the days leading up to her disappearance. Her full name was Deborah Elizabeth Griggs, but most people called her Debbie. In 1999, Debbie was 34 years old. She lived with her family in Deal, a coastal town in Kent, England. At the time, Debbie was the mother of 3 sons and pregnant with her 4th. According to documents presented during the investigation and trial, Debbie was a devoted mother. Therefore, when she suddenly disappeared without a message or any sign, her family immediately sensed something was wrong. The Griggs family life, from the outside, seemed quite stable. Debbie and her husband, Andrew Griggs, raised their 3 children together. They also ran a family seafood business. And in just a few months, the family was expecting a new member. But behind that seemingly peaceful facade, Debbie and Andrew's marriage was crumbling. According to evidence later presented in court, Debbie had begun considering divorce. Such a decision wouldn't just involve the marital relationship. It could also entail the division of assets and the business they had built together. At that time, no one could have known where this marriage was headed. To outsiders, it might just be a family going through the difficulties many other couples face. But in the final months before Debbie disappeared, another secret began to surface. And that secret would completely change the fate of the entire Griggs family. The man at the center of the story is Andrew Griggs. He was Debbie's husband. While Debbie was alive, Andrew worked in the maritime industry and ran a seafood business with his family. To many, he appeared as a hardworking man, a husband, and the father of 3 sons. After Debbie's sudden disappearance in 1999, Andrew quickly became the only one to tell the story of what had happened in the family. He said that Debbie had left voluntarily, that she left home with no intention of returning. According to Andrew's account, he was left alone to care for the 3 young children and move on with life. For years, that was the story those around them heard. It was also the story Debbie's children grew up with. A mother who supposedly chose to leave her family. A father remained, continuing to raise his children in his wife's absence. But no one knew that Andrew was controlling the only story his children were allowed to believe about their mother. According to what was later presented in court, Andrew repeatedly offered explanations to convince others that Debbie had mental health issues and was perfectly capable of leaving home on her own accord. However, those explanations became increasingly difficult to accept when compared with other evidence. There was no indication that Debbie was preparing for a new life. There was no evidence that she intended to abandon her 3 sons. And there was nothing consistent with a pregnant woman disappearing without a trace. For years, the image of the abandoned husband persisted, until investigators discovered a detail that caused the entire story to begin to crack. Not every domestic violence case leaves a long record of coercive control. In the Debbie Griggs case, the publicly available documents did not show a prolonged period of coercive control with manifestations such as phone monitoring, isolation, or financial control. But that doesn't mean there weren't warning signs. Looking back at the entire case file, several details begin to connect. The first detail is how Andrew Griggs spoke about his wife. According to what was later presented in court, Andrew told relatives, neighbors, and even medical staff that Debbie had mental health problems and was not complying with treatment. If those explanations were accepted, Debbie's sudden disappearance would be easier to explain. However, according to information cited from the case file, Debbie denied those claims in her personal diary. These are 2 completely different pictures of the same person. The second clue appeared shortly after Debbie disappeared. Andrew quickly presented a complete story. He said Debbie was angry, that she left home on her own accord, and that she chose to leave behind 3 sons. It was an explanation that placed all the blame on Debbie, while the only person who could confirm or refute that story was no longer able to speak. The third detail was particularly scrutinized by the prosecution during the trial. According to evidence presented in court, Andrew had a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old girl before Debbie disappeared. The prosecution argued that Debbie knew about this relationship. This was a crucial factor in assessing the cause of the marriage's crisis. Next came the financial issue. If Debbie had actually decided to divorce, the family's seafood business and related assets might have had to be divided. According to the prosecution's argument, avoiding the financial consequences of a divorce was part of the motive for the case. And finally, what happened to the 3 children? They grew up believing their mother had voluntarily left. That was the only story they heard for years. Then, years later, according to evidence presented in court, Andrew even tried to persuade one of the children to participate in a plan to obtain hair samples from Debbie's remains to create false evidence to prove she was still alive. It wasn't just an attempt to mislead the investigation. It was also an attempt to drag his own son into perpetuating a lie. Individually, these signs may not be enough to conclude a murder case. But in early May 1999, all those pieces began to converge around a marriage on the verge of collapse. At this point, the investigation is no longer focused solely on how Debbie Griggs disappeared. Investigators also have to answer a more crucial question. What led this marriage to a point of no return? According to the prosecution's argument, the first factor is a secret Andrew Griggs did not want exposed. At trial, the prosecution argued that before Debbie disappeared, Andrew had a sexual relationship with a teenage girl. Prosecutors argued that Debbie discovered this relationship. If the matter were made public, Andrew could face serious consequences for his personal life, reputation, and legal issues. But that wasn't the only pressure. According to evidence presented in court, the marriage between Debbie and Andrew was coming to an end. Debbie was reportedly considering divorce. According to the prosecution's argument, Andrew understood that a divorce meant not only losing his spouse, it could also entail the division of assets and significantly impact the family business. For the prosecution, this was a risk Andrew did not want to accept. More importantly, Debbie was no longer just someone who knew her husband's secrets. She was someone who could completely change his future. She could end the marriage, demand a division of assets, and bring to light the things Andrew wanted to hide. According to the prosecution's argument, it was the combination of these factors that constituted the motive for the crime. They argued that Andrew murdered Debbie to avoid the consequences of divorce and to protect his secrets. Andrew Griggs never pleaded guilty to murdering his wife. He continued to maintain that Debbie had voluntarily left the family. However, after reviewing all the evidence presented in court, the jury accepted the prosecution's argument and found Andrew Griggs guilty of murder. On May 5, 1999, Debbie Griggs was still a pregnant mother, preparing to make decisions about her future. The following day, Andrew said she had disappeared. May 5, 1999, was the last day Debbie Griggs was seen. According to testimony presented in court, she remained in the area of the family home in Deal, Kent. Her 3 children were still present in the house. There was no indication that Debbie was preparing to leave the family. There was no evidence that she was packing or planning to start a new life. Then night fell. According to the prosecution's argument, sometime between the night of May 5th and the early morning of May 6th, 1999, Andrew Griggs murdered Debbie at or near the family home. Public documents do not specify the exact time the incident occurred. No information has been released about the murder weapon. There is no publicly available conclusion about the method of the crime, and there is insufficient evidence to pinpoint the exact room or location where Debbie was murdered. What truly transpired during those hours was known only to Andrew Griggs. According to the jury's accepted argument, after Debbie's death, Andrew removed her body from the family's living area and attempted to conceal it. Years later, when Debbie's remains were found, the investigation revealed the body had been placed in a sealed plastic container, along with several items related to the case. But for someone to disappear for years, simply concealing the body wasn't enough. The remaining traces had to be erased. Debbie's Peugeot was later discovered about a mile from the house. Initially, the presence of the car wasn't enough to explain what had happened. But subsequent forensic investigation uncovered traces of Debbie's blood in the trunk. This became one of the most crucial pieces of evidence refuting the theory that Debbie simply drove away from home and voluntarily disappeared. The physical evidence began to tell a completely different story from Andrew's explanation. While the children were still very close, an event occurred that prevented Debbie Griggs from ever leaving the house as a free person again. But to make someone disappear for years, Andrew needed more than just to conceal the body. He also needed to make everyone believe that Debbie had chosen to leave. After Debbie Griggs disappeared, Andrew Griggs quickly offered his explanation. He said that the couple had had an argument. According to Andrew's account, Debbie left the house in anger. He claimed she left voluntarily, leaving behind 3 children, and cutting off all contact with family and acquaintances. That was the story Andrew repeated for years. To make his explanation more convincing, Andrew went on to emphasize the allegations that Debbie had mental health problems. According to what was later presented in court, he repeatedly told relatives, neighbors, and medical staff that Debbie was mentally unstable and not adhering to treatment. If that were true, her sudden departure from the family would seem more plausible to those around her. But then a detail began to shake the whole story. Debbie's Peugeot was found not far from the house. At the time, the presence of the car might have led people to believe that Debbie had driven away on her own and continued her journey in another vehicle. However, subsequent forensic examination revealed traces of Debbie's blood in the trunk. That evidence did not support the theory of a woman voluntarily disappearing. It is noteworthy that Andrew did not flee. He continued to live in England, continued to raise the children, and continued to maintain the story that Debbie had voluntarily chosen to leave the family. According to the prosecution's argument, this was not a flight from the scene or from the country. It was a process of information control, in which Andrew was the only one recounting what happened, while Debbie was no longer able to speak. In the initial stages, Andrew's explanation was sufficient to have the case treated as a missing adult. But there's one question the story never answers. If Debbie truly left voluntarily, why did a mother who was so devoted to her children never contact her family, never use her accounts, and never once try to see them again in the years that followed? Immediately after Debbie Griggs was reported missing, Kent police began an investigation. Investigators searched the family home. They examined Debbie's car. They verified her relationships, daily routines, and any clues that might indicate she had left voluntarily. From the outset, Andrew Griggs was under investigation. He was the last person believed to have been with Debbie. He was also the one who offered an explanation for her disappearance. But suspicion doesn't equal proof. There was no body, no direct witnesses, and there was no strong enough evidence to prove a murder had occurred. During the examination, investigators discovered a crucial detail. Traces of Debbie's blood were found in the trunk of her Peugeot. This finding suggested the vehicle may have been used in transporting or concealing what happened to Debbie. It was a remarkable discovery. But at the time, that evidence alone wasn't enough to build a case with a potential conviction. In 2003, the file was transferred to the Crown Prosecution Service. After reviewing all the investigative documents, the CPS concluded that the case had not reached the realistic prospect of conviction threshold, meaning there was no realistic prospect of achieving a conviction in court. The investigation didn't end, But it couldn't progress any further either. For many years afterward, Debbie Griggs remained a missing person whose true fate was unknown. It wasn't until 2018 that the case was reopened as a cold investigation. This time, investigators weren't waiting for a new witness to come forward. They didn't expect to find a single, decisive piece of evidence. Instead, they began reconstructing the entire case from the pieces that had been there for years. Debbie had no logical reason to leave her children. There was no evidence that she had built a new life. Andrew's explanation had many inconsistencies with the objective evidence. Debbie's blood was found in the trunk of the car. According to the prosecution's argument, Andrew's motive was related to the failing marriage and the personal and financial consequences that a divorce could bring. And Debbie disappeared precisely when those conflicts reached their peak. For the investigators, Andrew wasn't a suspect simply because he was Debbie's husband. He became a suspect because the entire chain of evidence, when put together, pointed to the same conclusion: opportunity, motive, behavior after Debbie disappeared, physical evidence, and the absence of any other plausible explanation. No body, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. But investigators gradually realized that Debbie's disappearance had left behind layers of evidence that Andrew Griggs could not explain convincingly. This wasn't a case where the prosecution had the autopsy results in hand from the start. There was no DNA identifying the crime scene. No murder weapon was recovered. And at the time of the trial in 2019, Debbie Griggs' body had still not been found. Instead, the case was built on multiple layers of physical and behavioral evidence, each layer undermining Andrew Griggs' explanation. The first piece of evidence lay in Debbie's Peugeot. During the investigation, forensic experts discovered traces of Debbie's blood in the trunk. This evidence alone couldn't prove the entire case, but it raised a question Andrew couldn't answer convincingly. If Debbie had truly voluntarily left home to start a new life, why was her blood in the trunk of the car? That evidence brought to light the story of a woman who voluntarily left, revealing undeniable contradictions. The second piece of evidence didn't lie in the crime scene. It lay in Debbie's disappearance itself. After May 5, 1999, Debbie never contacted her 3 children. She didn't use her identity to build a new life. She didn't appear in any official records. And she didn't contact her family or close friends. To accept Andrew's explanation, the jury would have to believe that a pregnant mother voluntarily abandoned her 3 children, her family, and completely vanished from society without a trace. After reviewing all the evidence, they didn't accept that hypothesis. The third piece of evidence was the combination of Andrew's motives and actions. According to the prosecution's argument, Andrew's relationship with a teenage girl, the risk of divorce, and the financial consequences constituted the motive for the crime. At the same time, his statements about Debbie's mental health and her voluntary departure from home were inconsistent with the evidence regarding her life and behavior before her disappearance. Andrew not only failed to provide a convincing explanation, according to the prosecution's argument, he would have been the one to benefit most from Debbie's complete disappearance. These 3 sets of evidence, when placed together, formed the basis of the 2019 verdict. 3 years later, the investigation took another crucial turn. In 2022, Police found Debbie's remains buried in a plastic container on the grounds of Andrew's former home in Dorset. At the scene, investigators also seized several items believed to be related to concealing the body, including a trunk liner and objects dating from the time Debbie disappeared. These findings were not the basis for the jury's verdict in 2019, but they reinforced the central conclusion the trial reached. Debbie Griggs did not voluntarily leave her family. But in 2019, the jury had never seen the buried container. They had to decide Andrew Griggs' fate based solely on what he left behind in his words, in his car, and during his 20 years of silence. After the case was reopened and the entire chain of evidence was reviewed again, the investigation finally surpassed what had previously been unattainable. Andrew Griggs was arrested. He was charged with the murder of Debbie Griggs. There was no chase. There was no evidence that Andrew resisted arrest. Everything happened quietly, but it was the result of nearly 20 years of investigation and re-examination of every piece of the case. At trial, Andrew continued to deny the charges. He pleaded not guilty to murder. He maintained that Debbie had voluntarily left the family in May 1999. After reviewing all the evidence, the jury rejected that explanation and found Andrew Griggs guilty. For many cases, that would be the end. But in this case, a different turn of events occurred after the verdict was announced. While serving his prison sentence, Andrew tried to contact one of his sons. According to what was later presented in court, he suggested that his son secretly exhume Debbie's burial place, take a lock of hair, and send it from abroad along with a fake letter. The purpose of this plan, according to the prosecution, was to create false evidence to make people believe that Debbie was still alive, to guide his son in carrying out the plan. Andrew was required to describe the location where Debbie's remains were hidden. This information could only be provided by someone who knew the exact location of the body. The son ultimately did not comply with his father's request. Instead, he decided to inform the police. This information led investigators to the grounds of Andrew's old house in Dorset. In 2022, after the excavation, police found Debbie Griggs' remains in a plastic container buried underground. It is noteworthy that Andrew did not collapse at the thought of confessing. He also refused to voluntarily reveal Debbie's burial place to acknowledge responsibility. According to what was presented in court, it was his continued efforts to maintain a lie that inadvertently revealed the secret he had tried to conceal for over 2 decades. After more than 20 years, Andrew Griggs finally led the police to Debbie's resting place. But he did so while still trying to convince everyone that she had never died. After nearly 20 years of investigation and numerous review of the case files, the case finally went to trial at Canterbury Crown Court in 2019. Before the jury, the prosecution presented a sequence of events that they claimed began in May 1999. They alleged that Andrew Griggs murdered Debbie, then concealed the body, fabricated the story that she voluntarily left home, and maintained that lie for 2 decades. According to the prosecution's argument, the motive for the crime did not stem from a single cause. It was a combination of multiple pressures at once. The risk of the marriage breaking down, the financial consequences of a divorce, and the fact that Debbie was allegedly aware of Andrew's relationship with a teenage girl. Meanwhile, The defense maintained Andrew's position. He denied killing his wife. He continued to assert that Debbie had voluntarily left the family and would not return. Finally, after considering all the evidence and arguments from both sides, the jury found Andrew Griggs guilty of murder. On October 30th, 2019, Judge Spencer pronounced the sentence. Andrew Griggs was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before parole could be considered. When pronouncing the sentence, the judge emphasized that only Andrew knew exactly how Debbie died and where her body was hidden. It was a secret he had kept for years, preventing Debbie's family from bringing their loved one home for burial. But the story didn't end there. After being sentenced to life imprisonment, Andrew continued his plan to create false evidence to make people believe that Debbie was still alive. That plot was eventually discovered and brought to trial. In 2025, Andrew Griggs was sentenced to an additional 3 years in prison for obstruction of justice related to a plot to falsify evidence. This sentence was handed down in addition to his life sentence for murder. That doesn't mean Andrew's punishment is simply 23 years in prison. He is still serving his life sentence, with the minimum term determined by his 2019 murder conviction. In the end, this story is no longer about Andrew Griggs. It's about Debbie Griggs, a 34-year-old mother, pregnant, with 3 sons, and a future that should have been ahead. But in May 1999, that future abruptly ended. For more than 20 years afterward, Debbie's family had no place to visit, no grave to place flowers in, no secure place to say goodbye. Her 3 sons grew up with the story that their mother had voluntarily left, while other relatives lived amidst hope, doubt, and a loss that never truly ended. The discovery of Debbie's remains in 2022 cannot bring back more than 2 decades of lost time. It cannot bring back her youth. It cannot bring back the childhood her children grew up without their mother. But that discovery brought something Debbie's family had been waiting for years. They could finally bring her home to rest. And they also got official confirmation of what they had always believed. Debbie Griggs did not voluntarily leave her children. This case also left important lessons for investigation. Missing persons cases that drag on for years should not be forgotten just because time has passed. Allegations of mental health issues in a missing person need to be verified with objective evidence, rather than automatically accepted as a reasonable explanation. And above all, not every case is solved by a single piece of evidence. Sometimes, justice is built from many small pieces: a bloodstain, a lie, a series of actions spanning many years. When put together, they can tell the truth more clearly than any justification. Some people disappear because they choose to start a new life. But there are also those who are forced into silence by the very people they once trusted most. The important thing is that the search for truth doesn't stop just because time has passed, because sometimes justice comes very late. But it can still restore the honor of the deceased and provide the answers that those left behind have been waiting for years. There are lies that persist not because they are proven true. They persist because the only person who could refute them has been forced into silence. For over 20 years, Andrew Griggs controlled the narrative of Debbie's disappearance. He was the one who recounted what happened, and Debbie no longer had the chance to tell the rest. But the truth has a quality that lies never possess. It doesn't depend on whether anyone still wants to conceal it. A bloodstain, a sequence of actions, a wrong decision. And ultimately, it was the persistent effort to perpetuate the lie that led investigators to where Debbie was buried. Justice cannot restore the years Debbie and her family lost, but it can restore to her what matters most, the truth. And sometimes, that is the only thing that can be given back to someone who has no chance to speak. Before you leave, I'd like to hear your opinion. Do you think this tragedy could have been prevented, or was it inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new investigation.